Yeah. So traveling back yesterday was pretty chill actually.
Okay. That's good.
I had a quick layover in Denver, but other than that, it was pretty smooth. Didn't have anything wild happen. I just slept for like the entire first flight, and then I just listened to like a long episode of Pints with Aquinas on the second flight. So
That's
it
solid.
was chill.
Hey,
Yeah.
I mean, I love Pints with Aquinas. Sometimes they're a little long.
Well, that's the goal. He says they're long form.
Yeah,
the goal is not the same as ours.
He stresses the long form
for sure.
I do think for flights or for drives they're perfect.
Yeah,
actually, honestly, because they really get into it too. They
do. That's the best part about it. I think there's something really cool about you ask somebody a question and then you don't have to if they start really getting invested in giving an answer, you don't have to start pointing at your watch and saying all right, let's wrap this up. You can really just let the person settle into it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's amazing because I work at my college. I have a student job taking care of the groundskeeping.
Mm-hmm.
So on Saturday mornings I have a long 4-hour shift, and so it's really chill just to put on the newest episode of Pines with Aquinas in an earbud and then just go to town working because nice. The work's very manual. It's not very intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
So I can just kind of
engage both, shut
my brain off, listen to Pines with Aquinas, and then just do whatever I'm doing with my hands. So
that's solid.
It's definitely coming clutch.
I'm hoping to actually. So I'm going to Seek in St. Louis in a couple weeks.
That's gonna be
so if
baller,
any of you are
dude.
going there, the podcast is coming. Well, mainly because I'm coming. I'm coming for the vocation office, but
also representing the podcast.
Yeah.
Shameless plug.
Exactly. Also, if I'm coming with the vocation office, to recruit guys who are maybe interested in coming to the monastery, and one of the things I'm trying to recruit them with is I'm helping to lead a pilgrimage on the Camino this summer, end of May, early June, and we're only.
Do you have any open spots left?
Yeah. I mean, I think we only actually have 2 of the 7 spots.
Okay, taken, guys, so. come crash those extra 5 spots.
And we're only charging $1,000, which
that's a steal.
The whole trip is really worth about $3,000 to $4,000.
$3,000 to $4,000, guys.
So
you're saving $2,000 to $3,000. Just come on.
But anyways, so
I'm not going on it, by the way. I'm just plugging for him.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. But at Seek Hallow, the app, that has.
Number one Catholic app out there, honestly.
Father Mike Schmitz, Matt Frad, Bishop Barron,
Jonathan Rumi.
Jonathan Rumi.
Yeah.
They're doing a special Hallow sponsor, Hallow contributor, whatever, event. Yeah, a reception at Seek, and I got invited.
Let's freaking go.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with me.
Being a content creator.
No.
Okay.
No, we're trying to actually do stuff between St. Vincent and Hallow.
So, that's sick.
And it's actually Brother Bosco, who we had on a couple weeks ago. It's pretty much entirely because of him.
Let's go.
Which is so dope. So I'm really trying to push, so yeah.
I just imagine you pulling up to this meeting. Or this event, and you're like, oh yeah, have you heard about my podcast?
I'm sure you've heard about my podcast. I mean, everyone, in the small sliver between Grove City and Latrobe, everyone there talks about it.
Yeah. And the 2 people at my college that have listened to a couple episodes. Shout out to both of you, by the way. You could go up to Matt Frad and be like, Matt, I've been meaning to have you on. We've been noticing you've been getting a good bit of notoriety, and so I think it's about time we invite you on our show.
I mean, look at our last video. We were.
We
booming.
had
at
solid,
least 12 views.
At least 12, maybe even 13.
Honestly,
we're getting bigger every day, man. But yeah, no, that actually is super sick. Are you going?
Loyal fans.
Is it partly campus ministry that you're going with for Seek?
Campus ministry is taking a group there for the conference. I'm not officially going under campus ministry. I'm going under the vocation office of the monastery. We're gonna have a booth there. Kind of, get a little bit. We don't do this kind of stuff,
right?
Which is we're really
branching out
with our hands. We're trying to recruit people with our hands tied behind our back. We need to up our game, so we're trying to do that.
Heck yeah, bro! I mean, are you gonna be able to hear any of the talks from Father Mike Schmitz or anything? Okay.
There's certain times where the booths are closed so that everyone can be
for the keynotes and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense.
So,
excellent. So for those of you going to Seek, maybe run into him.
Yeah, that would be sick.
That'd be gnarly.
And if you are a fan already, come and make some noise for us,
yeah, dude.
Build up, be like, whoa, man, it's that Brother Francisco from
he's kind of a Giga Chad,
Brotherhood.
low-key.
Yeah.
And if you're gonna give us a shout out, also
Yeah.
give me a shout out, because
We actually, over the summer, I took vows, and a student from St. Vincent, who her name is Sarah, she listens to the podcast, and she was the first time she met Nate, and I loved when she said, she's like, oh my gosh, it's like meeting a celebrity.
yeah,
That was probably like the biggest head.
that was
that
the
Nate-
nicest lie anybody's ever told me, but I'll take it, honestly.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, dude. So here we are. We're in Advent. We're approaching Christmas on Gaudete Sunday right now.
Yes.
We're recording, and yeah, how's Advent going for you so far?
Advent's going pretty good because actually Hallow,
Mhm.
they're doing a 25
They did a
days
special
with
thing.
C.S. Lewis, so I've
Mhm.
been doing that, which has been really awesome. I was behind a couple days, so I've been catching up, and
Is that
Um,
with Jonathan Rumi actually
he
reading?
leads most of it, and then
Okay.
Liam Neeson actually reads a
I
lot.
saw that. That's fire.
Which, because he was the voice of Aslan in the movies, they
That's
brought
the
him
connection.
in.
Okay. Is he Catholic?
No, actually,
Okay.
and there's actually some people were kind of like, because he's actually at points been very vocal about abortion,
No.
specifically about trying to bring
Cringe.
Ireland to like a point of like supporting abortion.
Yeah.
But that a way to evangelize people is, I mean,
However
He's
you can,
literally
whatever
reading
means you can
C.S.
use to
Lewis.
convert somebody, even if
Exactly.
it's working alongside them while they're still not converted yet. Hey, if
Yeah.
if Liam Neeson becomes Catholic, that'd be baller.
yeah, exactly.
That'd be
So
sick.
got to work with what you have. Yeah. So my Advent, I would say, it's been pretty good because of that.
Yeah.
I'm also working on, and actually you're doing it with me, a Joseph consecration,
Mhm.
consecration to Jesus through the heart of Saint Joseph,
Right.
that we're gonna do on Christmas Day.
Yeah.
So I'm getting super pumped
That's
about
gonna be
that.
fire.
Um,
Because he is the ultimate Giga Chad, and I mean he's really just a perfect role model for men of what a wholesome fatherhood looks like, and just being a protective man. And it's just like, yeah, it's gonna be super exciting getting to be consecrated to him, because we've made consecrations to Mary before, and there's something deeply beautiful about that, and many of the saints did that.
yeah.
But there's something I think really special about consecrating yourself to Saint Joseph, just because he is a father figure, and we need to embrace that. And it's on the rise right now. I think consecration
yeah.
to Saint Joseph has become a big thing, probably
definitely
largely
is.
thanks to that book by Father Donald Calloway.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it's getting big. So.
Actually, I didn't think about this just now, but so Joseph, as like you said, a model, especially for masculinity and fatherhood in men. But Joseph was the protector and guardian of Jesus,
Mhm.
right? But he was also perfectly obedient and humble.
Yeah.
So he was both like on defense, protecting, but he was also like perfectly submissive at the same time, which is when we talked about masculinity before, like that's kind of the perfect like combo that we need to have. But that kind of model, just in general, I think is how we ought to be in relation to so many things. Like, both willing to protect and to act and defend what is good and true and beautiful, but also at the same time be willing to receive humbly or obediently from either the church, God, or even from other people when they might have something to teach us. Specifically, that should be kind of what our relation with our own country looks like.
You're talking about sort of a balance between being defensive and also being in some way inclusive and tolerant of others. Like that, it seems like that's kind of something that's at the core of patriotism, is a certain balance. Because obviously when it comes to matters of like international dialogue and things like that, we want to represent our country and we want to be loyal to our country, or even not in matters of international dialogue, but just as citizens. We want to have a strong sense of national identity. We ought to. We ought to have that sense of national identity and a love for our country and a willingness to defend it. But there is an extreme that you can reach. You can go too far with patriotism and then start to approach nationalism. So it's really, I think you're right. It's like all virtues in some way. It's a mean between the extremes of, on one hand, nationalism, and on the other hand, I think we're seeing more and more nowadays, which is globalism. So I know you've written pretty recently about this topic.
Yes. Near and dear to my heart, actually, what true patriotism looks like for a Christian.
And since you did write about that, what does it, in a nutshell, to start off, what does it look like for a Christian? Because obviously, some people I think seem to think that no matter how far you go with patriotism, it's necessarily going to be commensurable with their Christianity. but that doesn't seem to be necessarily true. There's some people who
Mm.
kind of put their Americanism, at least in our country,
Yes.
over their Christianity, or they put their political views above their Christian identity. So how do you think
That's
they
actually
can fit
it's a
together?
really, really good point, and multiple popes speak on that specifically. Pope Pius the 11th, then the 12th,
Okay.
and actually Pope Francis all said that there are ways in which people kind of blend tenets of patriotism,
Like
or
democracy in our country's case, maybe.
sure, or even nationalism with a Christian identity or
Yeah.
Christian lifestyle.
Yeah.
Because, so for instance, let's look at nationalism specifically, which to define nationalism is a like myopic love of your own country
Mm-hmm.
in a unordered way, disordered
Okay.
way, so that you see your country as the only good one in the entire world,
Mm-hmm.
and that all others are like subpar to you, and that your country has ultimate authority,
Mhm.
and that like the political head of your country, your nation, the state, has supremacy
Over the
and
whole
sovereignty over
Yeah.
the world, and even in opposition to God, if you really take it
Right.
to its extreme.
world. Right.
So now
That's what you see, I think, in Machiavellian and Hobbes' Leviathan a little bit, that the sovereign in control of the state, he ultimately does dictate morality in his state.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I want to get back to that point in a
Right,
second.
right.
But so now there's aspects about patriotism or even nationalism that seem Christian, right?
Mm-hmm.
Taking care of your neighbor, right?
Mhm.
Taking care of those in your own country. Obedience, right?
Yeah.
Obedience to authority.
Mm-hmm.
Willing to sacrifice yourself on behalf of your country. You know, we're supposed to sacrifice ourselves for other people.
Mhm.
And discipline, right? They requires, you know, either as a soldier or as a good citizen. If you're loyal, it requires a level of sacrifice and discipline,
Mm-hmm.
so that you go beyond yourself for
Right.
their good. And that seems like all of those themes sound pretty
Yeah.
Christian,
That's
right?
part of the transcendentals, right? It's just that, and that's at the core of recognizing the transcendentals in life, is recognizing there's some cause that's greater than yourself.
Exactly.
And so
yeah.
patriotism seems to really participate that when it's well ordered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The problem is when nationalism or patriotism that's gone to an extreme
Mm-hmm.
loses universal charity. Pope Pius
Hmm.
XII says any patriotism or any nationalism that goes against the gospel is an apostasy.
Wow.
So that
Because it's a rejection of Christianity. as a
yeah,
whole.
he said and all the popes that I mentioned before all name nationalism as a concept, an ideology contrary to the gospel itself.
Wow.
Because Christ did not just say, love your neighbors, right? Love your
Yeah.
enemies.
Yeah.
That means that there's going to be people who identify differently than you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not to say, oh, to love our enemies, we all become the same. No, that's not what Christ
Right.
is saying.
Right.
You love them because they're distinct
Mm-hmm.
and separate from you, but not because you don't treat them as inferior.
Right.
And that's what nationalism
Mm-hmm.
naturally does. It also really devalues like a personal relationship with God,
Mm-hmm.
because that could threaten your personal relationship with the state, right?
Mm-hmm.
If somehow the state was to command you something, let's
Right.
for like an obvious example of a nationalistic state is Nazi Germany,
Yeah.
right? So that they commanding their soldiers to do things that are clearly a violation of the dignity that they owe other people.
Right.
Well, if you understand the Ten Commandments, now you're in your body, or who you are, right, is in contradiction.
Yeah.
Like, well, I owe this to God, but now you're saying I owe this to the state.
Mm-hmm.
Nationalists say, well, it doesn't matter what God says,
Right.
because the state has ultimate authority.
Right. It seems like Christ directly addressed this issue, you know, in the classic example where they brought him a coin. 'Cause, you know, the question the Pharisees posed to him is, who do we owe our allegiance to Caesar or to God? Like, basically, should we pay the tax or
Yeah.
not? And, you know, Christ's answer was simple. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Give to God what belongs to God. So to Caesar, you owe, you know, some of your practical loyalties as a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
So that means paying taxes. You know, in our country, that means we ought to vote. We ought to participate in, you know, the electoral process. And, you know, if necessary, if we're called on to serve our country militarily,
Yep.
then we ought to do that too. We ought to come to our aid, or to the aid of our country in defending her. But if any of the things that our country or the leadership in our country is dictating, if any of that is in violation of God's law or just directly contradicts it, then we have to like let go of them
Yeah.
in favor of God's law. We can't, you know, observe the ordinances of Caesar or of the U.S. president if it means violating God's law, which kind of itself, just that principle is acknowledging even among like two like people or two powers to which we owe some allegiance, there is a hierarchy.
Yeah.
There's the divine law, and then below that there is, you know, our civil law.
Yeah.
So.
And I'm glad you brought up that specific passage, because an article I was reading for a paper I wrote specifically cites that. It says nationalism is to render Caesar everything.
Yeah.
Your education, your own soul, your family. And if we think about it, right, Jesus says render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar because his image is on the coin, right?
Right.
But we're created in the image of God. So we render ourselves and our souls to God. And Pius says a state can demand goods and even like blood from its citizens, but it never can demand their soul. And that's really what nationalism is looking to do. That like there is no good end beyond the state, right? There's no good end beyond your country. And the end, or as the final cause, as Aristotle would say, is that towards which we tend. Like the final good, the final thing that we're made to be part of, made to participate in, that we're striving all of our life for. Nationalism says it's your country itself. You strive for nothing beyond
the good of your
state.
country.
Exactly.
Whereas it seems like in an ordered society, in a well-ordered society, I'm tripping on my words today, sorry. It seems like the final cause of your existence would be something in which your society participates but goes beyond your society. Because it seems like for all humans, our final cause is ultimate eternal happiness with God in heaven.
Exactly.
And it seems like in a well-ordered society, the politics and the political system are going to be ordered towards that, and they're going to contribute to reaching that end, but they themselves are not going to make themselves the end.
Yeah, and that's what a good society should be, and what patriotism as a virtue should shape a society to be, which is a best reflection as we can on earth of what heaven is supposed to be. A communion between those who share values, share identity, share some kind of life, and the understanding that like we must have a relationship and we must have a disposition towards that country and the people we live with it, because it's actually natural to us. It's natural to our who we are as created people, right? We were created for communion. What was the first thing God said it is not good for? For man to be alone, right? Everything else before that was this is good or very good. When the first thing God says in Genesis that is not good is for man to be alone. Right. So by saying that, he creates in his nature that he's meant to be with others. Right. So we are also meant to be with others. And by sharing in experience with others, we actually grow a sense of communal identity, which is how we actually, Pope John Paul talks about this in his Reflections, Memory, and Identity, that we grow to the fullest stature of our human persons through a discovery of our identity, which is only possible in a society, in a communal setting. Right.
That's really interesting then that from JP2 and from Aristotle, you see man is not perfected in his nature on his own. Right. To reach the perfection of his nature, he has to live in a community, and not just, I don't think, a social community. Like you could imagine, you know, some barbarian family or some like caveman family. Yeah, there's some sort of community there. They have maybe some social interactions and they're getting food for one another. But it seems like man can't fully reach the perfection of his nature until he enters a political community, right? Because I mean, you see this with even if you just look at the progress of history, you know, in the times of cavemen, yeah, they had families, they had their brothers and sisters that went out and you catch some food and you put a little food on the table, and so you survive for that night, and they might help shelter each other from the storms, so that they can kind of just survive on a basic level, but we wouldn't really call that day-to-day struggle of just trying to survive. We wouldn't call that the perfection of life. We wouldn't call that like the ideal life.
Thriving.
Exactly. It's not flourishing. It's just surviving. Yeah. So it's not until man enters a society that is political, it's not until then that he can really experience the full fruition of living well. Yeah. Because in a society that is political in nature, he can know that he's protected at night. He can know that he's not just, going to be food for some animal tomorrow. He can have supplies that last more than just to the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right. So he can start to not worry so much about fulfilling his survival, the needs of his survival, and he can move on to higher things. Learning, religion, those sorts of things, art, all these beautiful things that make life worth living. It seems like you need a political system to do that.
Yeah.
But the problem is that political system, like we've been saying, cannot be the final end.
Yeah.
So I think you see that clearly with nationalism, how nationalism, becomes disordered insofar as it tries to subject what is highest in man's nature, namely something ordered towards God, tries to subject that to what ought to be a means to attain that end, namely the political system. But what would you say, on the contrast, is the danger in globalism? Because it seems like nationalism and globalism are kind of two ends of the extreme.
Yeah, absolutely.
Inordinate love of your nation and then completely rejection of national identity.
Yeah.
So what's the danger in globalism?
So, actually, what you were just speaking about with like kind of being in a society allows you to start searching for these higher goals, right? Love of learning, use of your hands for the creation of art,
right?
Or engaging other people in higher intellectual conversations, whatever it is. That itself is building culture,
right? Okay.
So a cultural identity that is unique to those particular people who are sharing in the values of that space, right? So a society is most truly a nation when it is also planted in a place,
right?
And Pope John Paul will actually say that such that when you look at a particular culture, you identify it with a place, and when you look at a place, you identify it with a particular culture, so that they're like interchangeable.
Yeah.
The patrimony or what is handed on from before, values, traditions, experiences are handed on in a specific place to a specific people, right? So what globalism is doing is taking that completely away, for the purpose of kind of an equality of all people. Right. So what globalism is kind of an establishing a kind of a borderless society, where all peoples are united under kind of one banner, one leadership, whether it's like, the UN or some world council or whatever. It's kind of an equalization of all people, so that all people are given the same needs, right? They're all taken care of the same way.
Right.
The problem with that is, by globalizing all people, you have to fundamentally eliminate their distinctiveness and specifically their distinct value and culture. When you take those away, now people have no thing to stake their identity in, right? They just become a mass of people, humanity, right? And G.K. Chesterton actually says, you can't love kind of people from a distance authentically. You can't love a mass of people. You have to love individually, specifically. He said there will at best be this abstract love of other people if you kind of globalize everything. While it's important to see that all people are due equal dignity, right, and respect.
And charity, right?
Yeah, exactly. The problem is they have to like basically reduce everyone to a common experience, right? But what happens if you take away culture and you take away like identity like that, or their values? Is the only thing that we can give to you to show they're all equal, is material goods. Material goods becomes the only goal of a globalist society. That I will take care of economically so that you're all equal, but there's no way I can establish a moral equality among all people, because you had your own values, you had your own, and because if I pick one, now I'm saying, well, this culture becomes how everyone has to live.
Right. Well, okay, to play devil's advocate for a moment, it seems like you could have two countries, for example, that have maybe different customs or different practices as a culture, but fundamentally their civil law, for example, is rooted in the Ten Commandments. And so if you had those two kind of cultural identities, I don't see why it would be a problem to merge them, because, maybe there might be some changing of customs, but it seems like as long as their law is based on the same principles, there wouldn't be any problem with joining them together, would it?
Pope Francis says there would be that you're making people neighbors who never even had the experience of being brothers. So you're forcing a charity upon them that they didn't have naturally.
Right.
So if
But as Christians, we're supposed to have universal charity,
yes,
right?
which is called solidarity, which
Right.
is which is another virtue or a principle by which the virtue of patriotism must live by.
Okay.
But globalism is not solidarity.
Right.
Because solidarity still looks at an individual. Globalism cannot look and see individuals.
Interesting.
So even if, like you said, you had two countries that had different experiences, but their like principle and morality was the same.
Yeah.
Those principles would have to be applied so generally that they still couldn't look at individuals in those cultures and those anymore.
So even if you have two cultures that agree that killing and stealing is wrong, even if you merge them together, there's still going to be problems in the way they particularly interpret their practices and their customs.
Yeah, how they live them out. Also, you're presenting, like, while it's a good devil's advocate scenario, you're also presenting just a scenario that doesn't exist.
Right.
There are no, yeah, sure, we could even have half of the countries in the world that agree to one set of codes, but not all the countries of the world are going to. It's really just simply unrealistic.
Yeah.
But if it was to be employed, the only way to maintain order is to eliminate basically a moral order,
Which would probably involve also a totalitarian government that's infringing on everybody's
someone has
rights.
to enforce. Yep.
And a police state probably.
Yeah. Which is one place what's interesting that Francis says that he thinks this idea of globalism is really bad. But in Fratelli Tutti, his more recent encyclical, he says, I believe like we should really focus heavily on giving the UN more power, and they should really be given these things. And it's just a little contradictory.
I think some people don't recognize the UN as a globalist institution.
Yeah, and I think he sees it as like a means to give nations their own like platforms.
Yeah.
Like if the UN says this, maybe that will incentivize people to.
But the UN in reality has its own prerogatives, right?
Right,
Yeah.
and that's the problem. Is you will never be able to eliminate out of people a self-centeredness.
Right.
Someone somewhere will want to have control of that globalism, right? No one will ever step freely away and say, "Oh, I'm only in this for the good of everyone else."
Right.
It's just unfortunately that's our sinfulness
Right. It's
won't
just
allow
an
that.
effect of original sin, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't take the fallen aspect of human nature out of the equation when you're considering politics. But still, I guess one question I still have from what you're describing globalism as is this. Is the danger of globalism something intrinsic to it, or is it more arising from the way that globalism would have to be enacted? What I mean by that is, you said, okay, if you wanted to globalize the world and eliminate all borders, you would have to basically trample down, so many different cultural identities. And that obviously seems wrong because, for one thing, that would have to happen aggressively, so it would be violating people's rights. But also, it seems like it's unnatural because people have these cultural identities kind of ingrained organically, so you have to be basically telling them, no, you're wrong for having this natural tendency. So for those reasons, I see how it'd be wrong to, in our current state of things, try to execute a globalized state. But suppose, this is just hypothetical, suppose somehow that we'd started in a state where people were less inclined to like patriotism or nationalism, and where there weren't so many distinctions by nation. Would there still be something wrong in light of human nature just to try to have a globalized state, even if the way of achieving it wouldn't involve like violating a bunch of different cultures? Do you see what I'm saying? Like if that was the natural state of mankind, if we already just started out in this sense of living in a global community rather than living in nations, would there still be something wrong about globalism?
Two things come to mind. First is something G.K. Chesterton says in his essay, The Patriotic Idea, where he says that it is created within the order of creation that there be distinctiveness. It's God's will that there be distinction and diversity in creation.
Okay, wow.
And he believes that because that's built in, that globalism innately must be wrong, because it's basically trying to say, oh, even though God created distinctiveness, we're going to kind of look beyond that.
Okay.
Also, a biblical example of people who kind of were living this like universal family, global identity is the Tower of Babel.
Right.
They were speaking the same language. They understood each other. They knew everything. And what did they try to do? Make an idol out of themselves. Just like, in a sense, nationalism does.
Yeah.
But they're almost like, we're so united, we're all together, that we've got to have all the power. We have all the control. There's everyone desires this, right?
Right.
Instead of seeing like, okay, God is still the origin. I think globalism, where it also innately, like in its core, is wrong, is similar to nationalism, which is to see the state as its own end. I think globalism looks at like the equality of all people as the best end.
Right. And the human race itself as the best
and
end.
equality of all people is good if we still let there be distinctiveness. But globalism does not allow equal yet distinct.
Okay.
It's equal across all playing fields.
Equal and same.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Which is why it devolves into, as another article I read, just like basically a mob or a mass.
Right.
All of humanity is treated as humanity itself, right? All there's no human person. It's just humanity.
Right.
You are a cog in the machine because you are part of humanity. You are not Nate Whitaker. You're just part of humanity.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And it seems to me in some way that Christ told us, if you follow me, you're inevitably going to be pitted against world powers.
Yep.
And you're going to sometimes even have to be at odds with your neighbors and even with your friends and family. So it seems like to me, just going off what you're saying, if you did try to have a globalized community, it would be prioritizing, mutual equality and a unified community of all people. It would be prioritizing that end inordinately, because basically you'd be saying, okay, we're willing to let go of all distinctions. We're willing to let go of all individual principles and individual worldviews for the sake of this global unity.
Yeah.
And in doing that, I think a Christian would necessarily have to let go of his Christian identity.
Yeah, because
in favor of, well, I don't want to cause division with the guy next to me or with the guy on the other side of the world, because we're all supposed to be unified by globalism. So I guess I can't have my Christian views because that might be at odds with the guy next to me. So you'd have to let go of basically God in favor of man.
Yeah.
Which obviously is inordinate.
We're talking about patriotism or nationalism, kind of saying how we're supposed to, in this smaller context of a smaller nation or society, build a reflection of what heaven is, which is communion of all persons. I feel like globalism is trying to establish that heaven actually on earth. Not like a close resemblance of it, but actually make it.
Like Tower of Babel.
Yeah,
kind of,
exactly.
Right.
Oh, we are all united perfectly.
Right.
That's only possible in heaven. But if we kind of remove God out of the equation, then, then let's make it on earth. Right.
It seems like, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, it seems like those who are pushing for a globalized state currently are trying to do that. They're trying to establish the new Jerusalem on earth in this world. They're kind of trying to, in some way, institute their own end times, their own utopia. Yeah. Not rooted in worship of the divine, but purely in this inordinate worship of man. Yeah. And it seems like there's. Have you read the book Father Elijah?
No. Okay. I've read some of other stuff.
I know you've read other Michael O'Brien. Okay, for those of you who haven't read anything by Michael O'Brien, there's this great Catholic author. Is he still alive? Do you know?
Oh yeah.
Okay. He's a fantastic author and I think also an artist. And he writes these pretty long books.
Yes, quite.
Really great works of fiction and some science fiction. And they often have they're often very spiritually influenced. So I think the one book I read by him is called Father Elijah. It's about this priest set in pretty much just modern times. It's kind of like a parallel universe because it's modern times, but not exactly the same world we live in some ways, because it's stuff is going on in the current politics and headlines of the book that aren't happening in our time exactly, but very similar. So it's about this priest, Father Elijah, and he's basically sent by the Pope to investigate this man who they are supposing might be the Antichrist, prophesied in the book of Revelation. Yeah. And a big part of it is globalism. It's kind of this key element in the book is, and in the character who's presented as being maybe the Antichrist, a key element in him is that he is going to become the leader of just kind of a global community. Yeah. And I don't know if it particularly mentions the UN, but it's just you get the sense that the way that the Antichrist, you get the sense from this book, and I think it might be true in reality, as we may see in our own lifetime or sometime in the future. You get the sense that the way in which the Antichrist might try to institute, his parallel kingdom, and his rebellion against God, might be through a globalized community and a globalized political community.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes sense, just as Christ gave us the body of Christ.
Yeah.
It seems that the Antichrist is going to give us his anti-body of Christ, or his body of the Antichrist,
Yeah.
to unify people all around the world.
But in a warped way.
In a warped way, in a shared rejection and rebellion against God.
That makes sense. I mean, that tracks with the book of Revelation, right? The beast who comes to earth and, like, it says, all peoples worship the beast and the image of the beast, right? Versus worshiping Christ and the image of Christ. Yeah, that's I said, a very interesting take on the Antichrist and potentially another danger of globalism. But then what, as Catholics or as Christians, what our position ought to be is this mean between the extremes of globalism and nationalism.
The balance.
Which is patriotism. Which we can understand is really the love of everything about your country. But in an ordered way. That you see that your country, because of its shared identity, its culture, the people in it, the rights that all individuals have within that country, that all of those are due it, right? And you're willing to sacrifice yourself to defend it. But you also believe at the same time that all other nations have those same rights, and that they are owed the same value you desire your nation to be owed. And that in need, we should also desire their good so that the people in that country flourish, right? So that's kind of a universal charity. And also an ability to humbly receive. That, like, hey, they might be saying, like, hey, America, maybe you should shore up ideas here, or maybe you should, follow this policy a little bit more. We're really against that in a lot of ways. Like, oh, how dare you tell us? Or there's people in the United States that are just utterly hate our country. Which is
it's really interesting with what you just mentioned, because a lot of those people that hate America and hate American values, they also are only able to express their views so aggressively thanks to the rights that we enjoy as Americans. So it's really a funny what would you call that? A funny paradox, or a funny irony that these people are loudly proclaiming, we hate America. America was built on slavery, and it was built on these like horrible principles. Meanwhile, if you were in an actual tyrannical country, you would be shot if you said any of those things. But yeah, you're right. It's Christian patriotism. Really, it is a balance. It seems to necessarily take into account a natural love of your nation, and as Christ says, a recognition that you ought to give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But you have to have that universal charity, and when you are interacting with other nations, a Christian patriot must acknowledge the golden rule and say, okay, I'm not going to violate this nation in a way that I myself wouldn't want my nation to be violated. And, again, going back to the book of Revelation in a different way, in the book of Revelation, you see there's basically, I think it's when John's beholding the saved, he looks and he sees what he calls a great multitude from every nation and tongue. Right. So, and those are the ones that are washing their garments white in the blood of the Lamb. So they're saved, they're proclaiming God, and they're going to enter into the New Jerusalem. And guess what? They are from every nation and tongue. So a Christian patriot is going to recognize, look, yes, I do love my nation. I would willingly lay down my life for my nation. But, charity is owed to all, and salvation can be given to all.
That's so good. Pope Pius XII actually mentions that.
Really? Okay.
All nations, the gospel is for all nations. Right? And all nations are called to be saved. That doesn't mean that all nations are called to be the same. All nations are called to partake in this salvation. And really important principle is, this idea of solidarity, which is kind of loving all people. We're desiring to help them because of who they are as created in God's image. We can only truly do that if we first grow to love those people who are closest to us. Right. As John says in his letter, how can you love God who you do not see if you don't love the brother who you do see? Well, I would say the same thing applies to people across the globe. How can you say, oh, I love them, support them, take care of their needs? Sure, that's great. I hope you do that. But how can you say that if you don't talk to your own brothers and sisters, if you refuse to support your own country, that you share the rights and the privileges because of just being that citizen. How can you say, oh, I love them and I love their culture, I love all things about them, but you can't say the same thing about your own country? So he's saying, G.K. Chesterton says, like, you learn love of others by first loving the individual closest to you, which patriotism causes us to do, right? If you love those who are Americans first, and love those who you share a culture, you share values, you share an identity of citizenship, you share a history that was passed down, particularly ours, when a very independent, freedom, the American experience, the American dream. I love my brother and my country first, and saying, because I love this relationship, and that's what patriotism is loving your country and the relationship in it for the sake of the union that you have, not for the sake of the country or even just for the sake of the people in it, but for the sake of the good of the union that it fosters. That is a common good, the good of union. Nationalism can't give you a common good because it says the state's the common good. It is the end. Globalism can't, because the communion it fosters is very fake. And
unnatural.
Exactly. Whereas patriotism fosters a natural union that nourishes in us a love not just for the person and not just for the country, but for the union itself. And that's why patriotism is the virtue that Christians strive for.
That makes so much sense, especially in the context of recognizing that our ultimate end is union with God. Right? So it seems like patriotism prepares us in a way to participate in the shared union that we're hopefully going to have in heaven. And so it's just such a beautiful thing when patriotism is enacted in a good way, because it doesn't have to be this either you love your country or you love other countries, or like either you put your country's values first, or you want to have an open-minded care for the whole global community, because in reality, both of those, the one when it's executed in a healthy way will lead to the other. I think you saw the problem with an inordinate understanding of that concept in the Ukraine issue. There were a lot of Americans the same sort of Americans that would say they hate America, they hate their own country, but then they're saying, I stand with Ukraine, I want to, oppose any injustice that's done against Ukraine. Meanwhile, in their own local sector in America, they either don't take any, they don't support the country, they don't take an active role in making things better here. So it seems like you brought up C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters says, this is from the wrong perspective. This is from a devil. Screwtape, of course, is giving advice on how to bring humans to hell. He says, it's okay to let the humans exercise virtues in their fantasy as long as it doesn't inform the way they behave in a concrete way. So he says that, humans thinking nice thoughts and projecting nice feelings and fantasies, that's not going to get them to heaven. The only thing that will get them to heaven is actually doing good works. And so, well, of course, by grace. I'm not saying we're saved by works, but the point is you can't just be virtuous.
Actual display of what you believe to say.
Right. You can't be virtuous in your fantasy. And so what can happen in a wrong way, I think, if we have the wrong understanding of patriotism or trying to find a balance between globalism, nationalism, we can tend to sometimes think, oh, there's so many bad things going on in the world out there. I stand with those who are oppressed. I want them to be better, but then we don't do anything in actuality on a daily basis to stand against injustice in our country. Right. So patriotism really calls us out to, yes, love those who are all around the world, and recognize that we're all participants in this life, and we're all striving for the same ultimate end of happiness. So we have to have a common charity for all of them. But it also, patriotism, when well ordered, also calls us out to take an active role in seeking out the good in our country. And doing whatever it takes to protect the goods of our country.
Because if we protect first the goods of this country and the goods of our neighbors, and desire for that communion in our own country, we can then serve as a model and an inspiration for others to also strive and be able to do that, and a threat in a positive way to those who challenge that. If we say, hey, we can be independent, but we still care for you, that threatens countries who want to suppress or kind of absorb other nations into their own. So maybe you didn't realize that, how patriotic, your disposition can affect the globe at the same time. Or your duty to patriotism Because it's actually a
It
duty.
is for Christians. It's a responsibility.
Because it is in the nation that you grow in virtue. Because what the nation does for you there, you then owe it back to the nation.
That's something I need
justice.
to recognize more. Is
Yeah.
recognizing the duty of patriotism, because I think sometimes I tend to look kind of negatively on American politics and the whole society, and think, well, you know what, America's depraved, or our politicians are corrupt and don't share our principles,
Mhm.
so may as well just throw up your hands and kind of let it go, let it burn. Like I was
Yeah,
literally saying that to mom and dad yesterday. We were driving in the car, we were just kind of talking about politics and stuff, and I was saying, it seems like you kind of just want to like. I don't care anymore about how our political system goes at this point, because it seems like it's so messed up at this point. You may as well just let it be and let it burn and let it die. But that is the wrong attitude.
Yeah.
You do have to take a patriotic stance and desire what's good for your country, and you have to take action to achieve what is good.
And the action doesn't necessarily mean gun blazing, right?
No.
And stamping American flags,
Right.
waving your face, saying, we are the best country. With
Right.
You can believe you have the best country and that you're privileged to live in the best country, but you also have to let other people believe that they live in their best country. And I know some people who are so aggressively quote unquote patriotic,
Right.
that they're so negative about other people. That's actually not patriotism. So if you think you're being patriotic and you're like that, you actually aren't a patriot. You're a nationalist. And I don't want to throw that out there and sound like some of those woke leftists who are throwing out the word nationalist and fascist like every insult every other minute. But patriotism is an ordered love, and if your love for your country brings you to hate other people, it's not patriotism.
Right.
But if your patriotism, and you think you're a patriot, is so wishy-washy as to say, well, it doesn't really matter,
Right.
Like they have their relativism kind of a belief, so who cares what they do that? Like we can kind of, maybe it'd be best if we just kind of like all like set aside everything and just kind of like got along. That's also not patriotism. That's just kind of just nothing.
That's weak sauce.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize, probably as a country, many of us could, you don't want to ever advise people to go to an extreme, but the current trend as far as vice goes, I think, in our country is towards globalism. So I think sometimes to reach patriotism, we might have to take on an appearance that might be a little bit closer to nationalism. There's certain good political leaders now who are actually taking a stand. They're saying we need to restore American values and we need to restore our identity in dialogue with other countries. And people point to them and say, oh, they're fascist. They're just like Hitler. That's not true. It's just when a society is bent towards one vice on one end of the spectrum, to actually reach the middle, to reach the virtue, you're going to have to look like the opposite vice. Yeah. So some of us might have to look a little bit like nationalists to be true patriots, but it is a true patriotism is fundamentally a balance. Yeah. So.
And it's ordered towards, finally, the union, right? And that you desire and love that union that you have in your country, and desire that all people be able to also be privileged to share in that same union.
And hope and pray that union leads to the ultimate union that we're all seeking, namely union with God in the New Jerusalem, where we'll all share in that identity. So, So, thank you, I guess, I think it was probably a pretty good discussion. I think we wrap it up. Yeah. Thanks for joining us again, guys, and for all of you who are listening or watching, we just want to wish you Merry Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. And have a great one.
Yeah, have a good New Year, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah. Adios. God bless.